And welcome, Hillel, and welcome to everyone else who's tuned in today. We have an important and very pertinent talk ahead of us. As most of us know, the United Nations has a long and a shameful history of singling out Israel for a special attack that's been going on for many years. And in our day, this bias has been taken up by many others and now feeds a global effort to demonize the Jewish state and reduce it to pariah status, if not eliminate it altogether. Through innumerable hostile measures over the years, the UN has been catalytic in fostering and legitimizing these attitudes. Most of you, for sure, will recall what occurred on November the 10th, 1975, with the passage of the United Nations Resolution 3379, which maligned Zionism by reducing it to a form of racism. That was engineered chiefly by the Soviet Union and its Arab allies, and the harm that it did cannot be overstated. As U.S. Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it at that time, and I quote him, "A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction." No one knows this history better than our speaker today, and we're really truly honored to have Hillel Neuer with us. He's a very experienced international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist, and most importantly for our purposes, he's the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO based in Geneva, Switzerland. He will introduce us to the history that I just alluded to, and for sure talk about other high marks or low marks during this history. He'll also speak to what's been done, partly through his own agency and others, to speak back against it. Following his talk, as Günther said, there will be time for your questions and discussion. Hillel, it's my pleasure now to turn over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And it's an honor for me to address this forum. I've been a longtime admirer of the important gatherings, both in person in conferences and in print that you have spearheaded. And so it's really an honor for me to be here with you. Indeed, this evening, I'm now in Jerusalem, so the evening's about to begin, and I would like to discuss how it is that Israel is treated at the United Nations. We already heard a little bit, so I'll expand a bit. How is Israel treated at the United Nations? What are the reasons that explain, what factors explain some of what explains some of the distinctive treatment, the singular treatment that is meted out to Israel? And finally, how do groups like mine, UN Watch, which is dedicated to fighting anti-Israel bias, how do we fight back, if at all, can one even fight back? So let me delve right into it. A few minutes from where I'm sitting right here, there's a street in Jerusalem called Kaftet B'November, 29th of November. So there's a street in Jerusalem that is dedicated to a day that, where there was a United Nations vote. One might not think that Israel would have a street in Jerusalem dedicated to a UN vote, but they do, because indeed, I'm sure this learned audience knows that the United Nations General Assembly in 29th November 1947 voted to create a Jewish state. And at the time, the United Nations was seen as supportive of nascent Israel. Indeed, when the Arabs went to war against the nascent Jewish state at that time, the Secretary General of the United Nations remarked that the Arab states were going to war with the United Nations because the United Nations had voted to create a Jewish state. Indeed, the words Jewish state, which today are deemed racist perhaps by groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, which in the past year both released reports accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, both in the territories and in Israel proper. They might have forgotten, among other things in their reports, but that the United Nations on that day used the words Jewish state 30 times. So if you search for the words Jewish state in the resolution of 29 November, it appears 30 times. So in the early years, the UN was supporting the creation of Israel and a Palestinian Arab state, called for a Jewish state and an Arab state. But over time, the United Nations changed. By the 1960s, you had decolonization. So you had many new states joining. And although they typically joined what became known as the non-aligned bloc, the non-aligned bloc was actually quite aligned. The Soviet Union played a very significant role in shaping the discourse that emerged, which was anti-colonial, and it could have been anti-colonial against the Russians. We see how the Russians, how they colonized their part of the world, but anti-colonialism was against the West, and that was stoked by the Soviet Union. And so you had an anti-Western movement that emerged, and it was harder to go after the United States, which was very powerful, but you could go after what was perceived as its ally, Israel. And so you had this movement to attack Israel, initially led by the Arab states. So the Arab states, which had waged war with Israel in 48 and many years after, and was not successful at defeating Israel on the battlefield. But by the late 1960s, they emerged with these new states that had joined. An automatic majority had emerged, whereas any resolution you introduced by the Arab states would be automatically adopted. In the famous words of Abba Eban, I will paraphrase: if Algeria had introduced if Algeria were to introduce a resolution in the United Nations declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel was to blame, it would be adopted by 155 in support, 7 voting no, and 12 abstain. And that remains true, sadly, today. So the Arab states discovered that there was this automatic majority, and if they couldn't defeat Israel on the military battlefield, well, on the battlefield of international relations with the imprimatur of international law, they could automatically defeat Israel. And so you began to have one resolution after another. It began, started in the late 50s, early 60s, but really took off in the late 60s and culminated indeed in what Alvin described, the infamous canard, where the UN General Assembly, the same one that had voted to create a Jewish state, that there should be a state for the Jews, suddenly declared in 1975 that Zionism was a form of racism. And this was ironic, given that the nations, the countries that voted for it, many of them had just joined the UN under the banner of national liberation, self-determination. And that's what Zionism is. It's the movement for the Jewish people to have self-determination, to have a nation of their own. And that suddenly was singled out of all the peoples in the world that had created and received statehood. Only that of the Jews was singled out and labeled as racist. And that was not accidental. The United Nations, created in the wake of the Holocaust, to be racist was to be an enemy of humanity. And of course, this is the apartheid era, when the third world rallied behind anti-apartheid. And so, that stuck. And of course, the Soviet Union was very much stoking the flames of that libel that Zionism is racism. This was a major propaganda feature in Soviet newspapers, and radio was being broadcast all around the world. And there's a lot of research on that. So this reflected propaganda that was already being disseminated quite substantially on every day in Soviet propaganda in the KGB. So the UN declared Zionism as racism. Now, thankfully, 16 years later, when the Soviet Union, not accidentally, when the Soviet Union fell apart in December 1991, the US, under James Baker and John Bolton, who worked for him at the time, they managed to repeal, which was a very rare thing. If it's ever happened before, I don't know. The UN rescinded the resolution, and so Zionism as racism was repealed. However, sadly, in 2022, the spirit of Zionism as racism is very much alive throughout the United Nations in many UN bodies. It could be the World Health Assembly, which each year adopts only one resolution condemning countries, and it's Israel. So they don't condemn Syria and Russia for bombing hospitals. They don't condemn China for its role in the coronavirus. And pick your evil thing done by a country on health. They're not criticized. The only country that gets criticized on health is at the World Health Organization is Israel. Again, it's the Arab and Islamic states that lead the resolution, gets adopted by a large majority. The same happens at UNESCO, the UN Agency on Education, Science, and Culture, many resolutions against Israel there. The General Assembly every year has about one resolution on Syria, one on Iran, one on Myanmar, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel. Sometimes there's 20 on Israel. Now it's about 15, but 15 on Israel, one on Iran. So 15 times more resolutions. And just so you understand how that works, if a country were to introduce 2 resolutions on Iran, covering perhaps their persecution of women and covering their role in fueling terrorism in the Middle East, you would have Western countries would say, no, this is overkill. You're cluttering up our work. You know, one resolution is a lot. One resolution on any country is a lot. It's a lot of work. So to have 2 is almost unheard of. Quite rarely you may have 2 in a year. To have 15 is just sort of off the charts. But that's become de rigueur. That's become understood that you have 15 on Israel at the General Assembly. And I could go on at how this works throughout the UN. There are UN divisions. There's a UN Palestine division of Palestinian rights created in 1974, around that time, or 75, around the time that Arafat came to the UN. That was in 74. Then Zionism is racism. And they created these committees. It has a staff of about 15 or 16 people, millions of dollars, based in New York. It's equivalent to the size of the staff they have covering the division on like Europe. So there's a division on Europe and a division on Palestinian rights. And I could go on throughout the UN. I just want to actually focus on one body, and that's the human rights body, today known as the Human Rights Council, originally known as the Human Rights Commission. So what is the Human Rights Commission and Council all about? A bit of history. The Human Rights Commission was created in 1946. Its founding chair was Eleanor Roosevelt, great humanitarian of the age. René Cassin was French legal philosopher, was the vice chair. Together in the early years, these eminent idealists did great things. By 1948, they had created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a beacon of human rights for victims around the world. It speaks of freedom against torture, arbitrary detention, the right to life, equality, many good things. And so in its early years, the Human Rights Commission did good things. Over time, like the UN itself, it became hijacked by dictatorships. Instead of having idealists, individuals, you had countries joining. It became a body of countries. And paradoxically, instead of having countries joining that actually champion human rights, you had the opposite. You had countries joining whose only expertise in human rights lay in how to violate human rights systematically, for obvious reasons. Because although some might think, and some do think, that dictatorships or anyone else, what do they care about a human rights commission? It turns out they do care. It turns out that regimes, the worst regimes, actually, the more illegitimate they are, the more that they are unelected and fear for their legitimacy, the more they actually want the false badge of international legitimacy to be a member of the Human Rights Commission, and the more that they don't want to be condemned. To be condemned on the international stage means you are a pariah, and that you are weak, and it legitimizes the dissidents, the opposition. So China, Russia, the other countries, they will invest enormous resources to make sure they are never condemned. And well, Russia is getting condemned now, but it's quite rare. They normally don't get criticized at the UN. So at the Human Rights Commission, sadly, you had members joining like China, like Sudan, like Libya. In 2003, most famously, Gaddafi's Libyan regime was elected chair of the Human Rights Commission. That was sort of the low point of the UN Human Rights Commission. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, 2003, Colonel Gaddafi's Libya, chair of the Human Rights Commission. From Eleanor Roosevelt to Gaddafi, the rise and fall of human rights at the UN. And that was a very embarrassing point. And then Kofi Annan was on the defensive for many reasons, corruption, oil for food. And he said, well, let's do something new. Let's scrap it, create a new body called the Human Rights Council. And they created a new body called the Human Rights Council, which was supposed to be made up of good members. The members today are actually worse than it's ever been. The new and improved Human Rights Council, created in 2006, includes China. Russia has just been suspended, but they were a member up until last week. We played a role in getting them suspended. China, Russia was a member, Cuba is a member, Venezuela, Eritrea, Libya, Pakistan, the list goes on. It's actually 60, Kazakhstan, which just killed many of its own people. 68% of the Human Rights Council today are dictatorships or other forms of non-democracies. So as you may imagine, coming to the Israel issue, as you may imagine, while a handful of countries do get condemned, North Korea is weak, they get condemned. Syria in recent years lost its allies, they get condemned. And a number of other countries get condemned. Iran gets a light resolution. They have a monitor watching Iran, but very little is done. The resolution is rather short. But so a handful of countries get criticized, and then a disproportionate amount of the Human Rights Council's attention is devoted to condemning Israel. Let me give you a few examples of how Israel is singled out for differential and discriminatory treatment at the UN's highest human rights body. So first, there's the agenda. Before the Human Rights Council even gets to discussing resolutions, in every session, they examine resolutions. And in every session, they follow the same agenda. And the agenda is the same at every meeting. We meet 3 times a year in September, March, and June, and it's always the same agenda. And the agenda has agenda item 2 is the report to the High Commissioner. Item 3 is civil and political rights. Item 4 is human rights situations around the world. If you want to take the floor and talk about any country in the world, 193 countries, you can do so under agenda item 4. And then they get to agenda item 7, which is human rights violations in occupied Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So it's basically one agenda item on the whole world, agenda item 4, and one agenda item against Israel alone. No other country in the world, not Sudan, not Syria, not North Korea, not Russia, gets its own agenda item, only Israel. And that is a really blatant example of how Israel is singled out. It's built into the agenda of every single meeting. You have the agenda, there's 10 items, they're all generic except for number 7. That one is targeting Israel. It has a euphemism, it's about Palestine, but it's targeting Israel. And it's basically, you have a day on the whole world and a day on Israel. And it's probably the most infamous, currently the most infamous example of how Israel is singled out at the Human Rights Council. All right, then the session begins. We just had a session that ended now, lasted about 5 weeks. And you go through the session and they adopt resolutions. And the same like in New York in the General Assembly, in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, they have a handful of countries. There's 1 on North Korea, 1 on Myanmar, 1 on Iran, and 4 on Israel. These 4, what's in the resolutions, one resolution says Israel must give the Golan Heights back to the genocidal ruler of Syria. So that's one resolution. So Golan Heights, which is, you may think it should go back, but it's not a human rights issue. There's no massive human rights issue in the Golan Heights where there's maybe there's 20, 30,000, I don't know the exact number, of Syrian Druze whose lives have been immeasurably improved since Israel began ruling the area. It's not a global human rights issue. So there's 0 resolutions on China, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, million Uyghurs in camps, 0 resolutions. Human rights in Saudi Arabia, 0 resolutions. Human rights in Pakistan, where women have acid thrown on their faces for violating family's honor, 0 resolutions. Lebanon discriminates against Palestinians and many other terrible things, 0 resolutions. Egypt, 0 resolutions. Zimbabwe, we just had our annual Human Rights Summit. We had Hopewell Chinono from Zimbabwe, a journalist who talks about corruption there and how the health system is destroyed. They don't have basic, health system to deal with cancer and machines that they need in the hospital. And he's being persecuted now for having spoken out against the regime. 0 resolutions on Zimbabwe. You go around the world, most countries in the world have 0. Israel has 4. 1 is on the Golan, 1 is on the settlements, 1 is accountability for past crimes. So you have the Goldstone report from years ago. How are we implementing the Goldstone report? Those are the sort of standard resolutions. Then you have emergency sessions. I mentioned the Goldstone report when there was a war in 2008, 2009, emergency session in Geneva to condemn Israel for violations, then create a commission of inquiry where normally the verdict is predetermined. That turned out to be the infamous Goldstone report, where whatever Goldstone intended, the people who write the reports belong to the UN Secretariat, which is extremely anti-Israel. The Goldstone report, for example, one of the staffers, a woman named Dr. Grietje Bars from a Dutch born. She was, a year later, became the spokeswoman for the flotilla, the Mavi Marmara flotilla campaign. She was the European spokeswoman, and she had worked for other anti-Palestinian causes. The professional, neutral, working for the Office of the High Commissioner, helping write the report. So it's important to understand that there's a whole ecosystem here involved of member states that are dictators, a civil service that tends to be viciously anti-Israel, that gets hired, a cooperation with NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, which are very integrated with, for example, the Office of the High Commissioner. So you have a whole ecosystem of anti-Israel actors. I talked about the resolutions. I want to finally give an example about the experts, known as either independent experts or special rapporteurs. And I'm going to mention two of them. So the UN Human Rights Council, in addition to adopting resolutions, it names experts on countries or on themes. So countries, there is an expert on Iran, on North Korea, on Myanmar. There's about a dozen countries that get a monitor, and the Palestinian territories gets one. We could debate whether out of 12 situations in the world, geographical, Palestine should be one of them, but okay, fine. But although the title is to investigate human rights in the Palestinian territories, in fact, the mandate is to look only at, quote, Israeli violations. So if there's Palestinian terrorism happening, as happened recently here in Israel, in Hadera, in Tel Aviv, and other places, and Beersheba, that is not within the purview, within the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Palestine. Their mandate is to look only at, quote, Israeli violations. The mandate dates back to February 1993, meaning even before Oslo, before the Palestinians had any control over Gaza and major cities in the West Bank, and it's been unchanged. So it's not really about protecting Palestinian rights. It's only to condemn Israel. Who's held the position for many years? The last mandate holder was Michael Link, who recently reported that Israel is an apartheid state. That was his outgoing report. And for many years, it was a man named Richard Falk, and I'll tell you a word or two about him. Some of the academics on this call may know him. He was a Princeton professor, actually, and has long been an apologist for anti-Western terrorists. He was Special Rapporteur in Palestine from 2008 to 2014. When he was appointed, I went to the president of the Human Rights Council. I said, you're about to appoint Richard Falk, but you're supposed to appoint someone who's objective and neutral. And you are appointing someone who has written this article. And I handed it to the chair of the Human Rights Council. The article was entitled Slouching Toward a Palestinian Holocaust, in which Richard Falk had accused Israel of basically planning the Holocaust against the Palestinians. So comparing the Israelis to Nazis. And he's the one there. I said, you're going to appoint this person. And the chair said, Hillel, I've seen the article, but on this appointment, my hands are tied. I have no choice. The Arab states told me that he's their selection. And they told me that he's American and he's Jewish. And they were right. Richard Falk is American and he's Jewish in the sense that he has zero identification with Judaism. He says that even growing up, he had not even the ethnic affiliation with Judaism, really zero, except when he wrote the article saying that Israelis are like Nazis, he wrote that, of course, as a Jew, I'm ashamed. So there was a book in England that spoke of the Ashamed Jew Society. Richard Falk, along with some others, perhaps Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch, could equally be the co-chairs of the Ashamed Jew Society. So Richard Falk was American and Jewish, and so the Palestinians, that was why they brought him, so that he could accuse Israel of terrible things, and they would have that immediate defense, which is persuasive for some. So that was the expert on Palestine. That was there for many years. And then there's another expert I'll mention. There's expert on themes like women's rights, children's rights, environment, all kinds of like 40 different thematic experts. And one of them is on hunger. They call it the right to food. And for many years, it was the first and mandate holder who held it the longest was a man named Jean Ziegler. He was the UN expert on the right to food. And of course, when I arrived in Geneva 18 years ago, he gave his report, and it turns out the only country in the world that he visited that year was the Palestinian territories. And he had a 25-page report saying that Israel is starving Palestinians. And by the way, he thanked the Israelis for giving him opening doors, the foreign ministry, others allowing him to visit. Thank you very much. And now let me tell you how Israel is starving Palestinians. So that was the only place in the world he visited. Didn't visit Burundi or Yemen, where people were actually starving. So that, in a nutshell, is how the Human Rights Council works. I mentioned the resolution. I mentioned that the Human Rights Council has agenda against Israel. It has more resolutions on Israel than any other country. They have the experts that are supposed to be objective, but we have Richard Falk and Jean Ziegler. And last, I was going to mention one of the resolutions adopted last year created a commission of inquiry that was looking not only into the last war between Hamas and Israel. It was created last year in May 2021, looking into alleged war crimes by both sides, but we know it's meant to target Israel. But they're also looking into something called systematic discrimination, to root causes, including systematic discrimination based on religion and race, national origin. And if you're not sure what that's going to be about, within a few weeks, they appointed Navi Pillay to chair the commission. Navi Pillay was the former UN human rights chief. And she, can you hear me now?
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, okay, good. I'll probably be about another 5-10 minutes and then I'll take questions. Navi Pillay is someone who actively lobbies, signs manifestos that are entitled "Sanction Israeli Apartheid," urging countries to boycott and sanction Israel. So again, it's not just statements she's made to this effect that Israel is an apartheid state, but she actively signs manifestos that urge governments to boycott Israel. She was named the chair of this inquiry. So it's very clear what they have in mind, that this inquiry, which is meant to report, it's perpetual, it reports every year, which is almost unique, may not be unique, but almost unique. She's meant to examine whether either of the sides is engaging in systematic discrimination, and she actively lobbies to sanction apartheid Israel. So this is absurd on its face. And, we filed a motion that she should recuse herself because of her bias, which would be the case in a normal court of law. That the UN Human Rights Council is all political. There is no court of law, there is no justice, and it's all political. Whatever Pakistan, Cuba, Venezuela, and the others vote for is what they get. And they voted for this commission and they got Navi Pillay. So it's quite clear what's going to happen in June is that there's going to be a UN Commission of Inquiry. You're going to see the headline, UN Commission of Inquiry, South African judge, a woman of color, she's of Tamil descent, who fought apartheid in South Africa, which she did. She says Israel's an apartheid state. And so that's going to be the headline. It's going to come out at the latest June 13th, may come out a bit before, but that's when they present, is June 13th. So you can get ready for that, really to revive the libel of Zionism as racism. Okay, so what I've described for you is a campaign to demonize and delegitimize Israel. Who's behind it? It's led by the Palestinians together with Arab and Islamic states. Pakistan, whose foreign minister went on CNN last year and was asked certain questions about Israel. And he said, they control the media. And the CNN anchor woman, who was very quick, she said, who do you mean? She said, those with deep pockets. And the campaign to demonize and delegitimize Israel, it's spearheaded. Those who introduced the resolutions and the agenda items are the Palestinians together with the Arab and Islamic states. That doesn't get you the majority. So what explains, what stands behind this campaign? So I told you who leads it, but why do they get such large majorities, which they do in New York and in Geneva? And why do so many countries go along with it? And in my opinion, there are several factors, briefly. One is the Arab and Islamic states historically have huge oil reserves and have used the oil weapon starting around 73 in a very powerful way. If you don't vote for our resolutions, if you support Israel, we will break ties with you. We won't sell you oil. And that was very significant for many countries. That's number one. Second is sovereign wealth funds. Qatar may have billions of dollars, and we've seen it. And countries say they're afraid if they don't vote with these resolutions, they may lose billions of dollars in investments. So oil, money, vote trading. The United Nations works by vote trading. Your country may have no dog in this fight. You may not have any particular prejudice one way or the other, but you have 56 ambassadors from the Islamic group out of 193. It's very influential. 56 ambassadors calling you, saying, you vote with us, we'll vote for you. China, for example, China votes for every resolution against Israel. And when their issue comes up, when the Uyghurs, China is persecuting at least 1 million Uyghurs put into camps, according to reports. And there's never been a resolution against China. The Muslim countries have never done a thing. I speak out for the Uyghurs way more than the Muslim countries, who've even signed letters at the UN saying we praise China for their treatment of the Uyghurs. And China knows they vote with the Arab countries, the Muslim countries, they vote for them. Vote trading. The Islamic group has 56, the Jewish group has 1. So it's a no-brainer. Finally, I would say fear of terrorism. You had a lot of terrorism starting in the 1970s. Many countries fear that if they are one of the handful of countries that stand with Israel, maybe they'll be targeted by terrorism. All of these reasons are realpolitik. You may not like them, but they could explain why a country just looking out for their own interests may decide to vote against Israel, even if bilaterally they may have great relations. And you have many countries that have very good bilateral relations with Israel, but at the UN, they vote against Israel. I would say it's not only rational reasons, because what I described here are rational reasons. I think there are also irrational or supra-rational forces at play. Countries do act according to their history, their narrative, and there are human beings at play. When I see, for example, the European countries, which at the General Assembly, the European countries typically support 3 out of 4, meaning 75% of the resolutions condemning Israel are supported by the European countries. I'd say America votes no, Canada votes no, Australia somewhat. European countries, 75%, they vote yes. And then a handful, they abstain. When I see them voting yes, the European diplomats, when I watch them and I interact with them, I don't see them forced because of the money, the oil, the vote trading to vote. Many of them seem rather comfortable condemning the only Jewish state for all kinds of reasons. And, I do feel, as my teacher, Professor Kotler, who's described this situation, in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was the Black Plague, and you pointed the Jews for poisoning the well. And when I sit there at the UN and there's human rights abuse and war happening around the world, and often the only country that is condemned is the Jewish state, seems to be scapegoated for the world's ills. And many countries seem content. They seem content to have these permanent inquisitions. Okay, they call it an inquiry, but to me it seems like an inquisition to be condemning the Jew. It's sort of, there seems to be a ritual aspect to it. And as you're going through a ritual and there's the emotions of lynching the Jew, that is, I've been there 18 years. That is how I perceive things in my watching these people. Doesn't seem to only be motivated by these rational reasons. For many countries, maybe not all, but for many countries, there seems to be a certain comfort in condemning the Jewish state. So Israel seems to be treated, in the words of Jacob Talmon, as the Jew among the nations. Briefly, because I want to take questions, how do we fight back? My organization, UN Watch, is a human rights organization founded in 1993 by a great civil rights leader, Morris Abram, who was attorney for Martin Luther King and helped fight for the principle of one man, one vote in American law to give equal rights for African Americans. He helped draft the UN Convention on the elimination of racial discrimination. And when he retired as US ambassador in Geneva in 1993, he created UN Watch to monitor the UN according to the principles of the UN Charter, the universal mandate. And we speak out today on human rights issues around the world. We just hosted our 14th annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights with 25 other NGOs, small human rights groups. We had some of the most courageous champions of human rights who were in prison or whose husbands or fathers are in prison from China, Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Saudi Arabia, many other countries, Nicaragua. And so we're doing human rights work, but we're also the leading group fighting anti-Israel bias at the UN. And how do we fight back? Many say just give up. We think we can fight back. I'll give a few examples. One is diplomacy. Try to urge countries to do the right thing. I was very happy to see, you all know Durban 2001, a traumatic event where the World Conference on Racism became a conference of racism, where Israel was singled out in so many ways, a traumatic event for Jews who were there. But they just had Durban 4, the 20th anniversary, and 38 countries pulled out. So basically virtually all the major democracies pulled out of that event. And that's something that we played a role in doing back in 2009 when we got 10 countries to pull out, and now most recently 38 countries. That is quite significant. Sometimes you can get countries to do the right thing. We've been speaking out on changing votes at the Human Rights Council. The UK announced a few years ago, every resolution introduced under the discriminatory agenda item 7, the UK will vote no, and now they vote no, which is quite significant. So sometimes diplomacy can work and we can convince countries to do the right thing. But I'm not going to lie to you, in many cases it doesn't work, and they continue doing what they do. And in my opinion, since it's really a battle of legitimacy, it matters who stands behind the votes. And many people in Europe, even perhaps in Canada, my country where I come from, believe that when they read a headline, UN says Israel's a racist state, they imagine the UN Human Rights Council says, it's like, and the Lord said to Moses at Sinai. They imagine men with long white beards, with white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, or morality, when in truth, nothing could be further from the truth. Sitting around the table are not Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, but more likely, Gaddafi, Castro, and the House of Saud. And that's something that we expose every day. And the fact that Russia was removed, once again, they were suspended, put attention on who the members are, and the world was reminded that the members today are 68% non-democracies, as I mentioned, Cuba, Venezuela, Pakistan, etc. So that's something that we're often able to get out to the world and sort of strip away the false legitimacy that's bestowed on the Human Rights Council. Many of you who are, this is an academic group, so maybe you guys are not on YouTube so much, but UN Watch has managed to bring some famous people like the son of Hamas, who came and denounced Palestinian hypocrisy. He spoke at the Human Rights Council and his video was seen millions of times. I gave a speech called Algeria, Where Are Your Jews? When Algeria and other Arab states accused Israel of apartheid, I asked them where their Jews are, and they didn't really have an answer. That was seen millions of times. We brought Colonel Richard Kemp. When the Goldstone report came out, he took the floor and said that no army in the history of warfare has done more to avoid harming civilians in a combat zone than Israel did in that operation, Operation Cast Lead. Colonel Richard Kemp. We go after abusers. I mentioned Richard Falk was the expert on Palestine. We exposed the fact that he was actually one of the leading supporters of the 9/11 conspiracy theory, the theory that it wasn't Al-Qaeda and 19 terrorists that took out the World Trade Center and bombed the Pentagon, but rather a conspiracy by the US President George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld to bomb their own country, kill their own people, and justify wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a theory believed by many people around the world. Richard Falk happens to be the most prominent proponent. He wrote the foreword to the book, the Bible for 9/11 Truthers, called The New Pearl Harbor, in which he praised the author for his courage and so forth. And on his blog, he was writing, we need to find out what really happened on 9/11. We exposed that. We got him condemned by Ban Ki-moon. First time ever that a human rights expert was condemned by his own Secretary General. Richard Falk retired, but to this day, every few months, he writes how UN Watch ruined his life. He lost academic appointments because of that. And it's not what he meant to say. He meant to say something else. But we exposed the fact that he actually supports worse conspiracy theories, he also supports Hamas. And if we were able to give him nightmares, then perhaps it's a badge of honor. So his false halo as a human rights expert who's exposed as an apologist for terrorists and a proponent of conspiracy theories. That's Richard Falk. And I mentioned Jean Ziegler. He was the expert on hunger who targeted Israel. We exposed the fact at a press conference that he actually was the co-creator of the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. And I couldn't make that up if I wanted to. The Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, given one time to Louis Farrakhan, given to Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, and in 2002, given to the late Holocaust denier Roger Garaudy, and to Jean Ziegler himself, who won the Gaddafi Prize in Tripoli, Libya. He denied it. We found video, exposed him, and got him disinvited to the Salzburg Music Festival, where he was going to be the keynote speaker, and he was disinvited because of that. So there is a way to expose abusers, and that's something that we do on a regular basis. To sum up in a nutshell, it's very much an uphill battle, but we refuse to give up. And as the rabbi of Lubavitch, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was supposed to have said to Netanyahu when he went to the UN, the United Nations may be an assembly of darkness, but it's our obligation to light a candle of truth, and that's what we try to do. Thank you very much.